You're listening to Podcasts with Park Rangers, a show where we explore the importance of our national parks and historic sites with those who live and work in them every day. We'll learn about history, science, and the beauty of nature from a unique perspective. I'm your host, Lucas VK. Today we interview Ranger Steve Adelson, an interpretive park ranger at Little Bighorn Battlefield National Monument.
When I do what I do here at Little Bighorn, when I talk about the battle, when I present the story to visitors from all over the world, I don't care directly if they understand what firearms were used, what tactics were in operation, what the hierarchy of command was, even though those things play a role in understanding the story, but I want them to feel what happened here.
Stay tuned. We'll talk about a controversial battle which you may know better by a different name, Custer's Last Stand. If you've been enjoying our podcast, we hope to keep this show on the road with your support. If you'd like to help out, find our Patreon page in the show notes or visit podcastswithparkrangers.com. Little Bighorn is the first battlefield we've had on the show, and I'll be honest, we struggled in this interview. How do we talk about such a visual and visceral event without pictures, video, some form of visual aid? The landscape of a battlefield often plays a pivotal role in how history played out. But unless you can see or walk the terrain, you might just lose sight of why events occurred as they did. Along a river in the rolling hills of Montana, there are a plethora of ravines to crouch in and hills to hide behind. The only major marker of import in this landscape is a big hill, now called Last Stand Hill, where Custer and many of his men drew their last breath. We found ourselves asking, how do we cover one of the most debated battles in U.S. history? Thousands of books are written on this battle alone, and accounts vary due to the sheer chaos of events. Not a soul of Custer's soldiers on Last Stand Hill survived, and as a result, several writers mythologized Custer's actions. In today's interview, we wanted to uncover the battle's importance and dip into modern accounts to see how the monument itself evolved over time to take in both sides of events. In fact, this battle isn't as controversial as it once was. Archaeologists uncovered many of the mysteries of where Custer's men fell on the field. Additionally, local tribes stepped forward to help paint a picture of the day's events. So, what else can we learn about the Battle of Little Bighorn and its significance? To find out more, we sit down with Ranger Steve Adelson.
Welcome to Little Bighorn Battlefield National Monument. This is an incredible story. It's a story that still haunts the American consciousness even today. My name is Steve Adelson, seasonal ranger interpreter at Little Bighorn Battlefield National Monument.
Ranger Steve has a deep love for history, which drew him to work at Little Bighorn, the beginnings of which can be traced to a gift he received from his grandmother.
I can remember my grandmother got me Encyclopedia Britannica set when I was 12, and I used to pour through that and look at different things, and that was actually my first exposure probably to the Little Bighorn story.
For 9 seasons, Ranger Steve worked as a seasonal park ranger at Little Bighorn, and it's the only park he's worked at.
Yes, this is my only NPS experience. People have asked me, if you're interested in going to another park, and the answer to that is if I got the opportunity to go to Pearl Harbor, I'd probably pursue that. But otherwise, this is where part of my passion for history lies, and so I'm like a gopher in soft dirt here. This is a fascinating story, much like the Alamo or the Titanic. You've got tremendous loss of life. To some degree, it's a mystery, and people are enthralled with that type of a story.
As you can probably tell, Steve is fascinated by the Battle of Little Bighorn. In fact, he's spent much of his life studying and teaching about it academically.
Well, I retired in 2007 from public education after 30 years. And I've been actually teaching classes on this battle prior to my retirement through Montana State University in Bozeman and several other college agencies. And most of my students were teachers looking for graduate work and summer opportunities, summer courses. And so I actually put together a couple classes. One was called Apocalypse at Little Bighorn, Custer's Final Battle. And that was my flagship course. I attracted about 400 students through that course, and that kind of gave me a foundation of understanding of what this story was about. So when I retired from that, it was sort of a natural transition into this.
So was that your first exposure to this story here?
No, it wasn't. I had studied it prior to that. I did my graduate study, my master's degree at Eastern Montana College in Billings, Montana. So I was only 45 miles from the battlefield.
Yeah.
And so I started coming out here in my late 20s and reading and coming out and reading and coming out. And so I just began to develop a knowledge base at that time.
Just based on location and repeated sort of exposure.
Well, and easy access,
yeah,
and
sure.
Reading books and coming out and looking at what you had read about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it helps to kind of get a lay of the land. So we'll definitely kind of talk more about the landscape here in a bit.
And also, I happened to run into an old timer by the name of Hank Weibert, who grew up over on Reno Creek, very close to the battlefield.
Okay.
And he had done a lot of metal detecting. And he had an incredible collection of artifacts. And he invited me to take a look at those artifacts, and I was stunned at what he had. And that was just fascinating to me. So that even magnified my interest to the story.
Yeah, seeing that private collection and his own exposure to these little elements of it. So just to set the stage, sort of the events of the time that we're discussing here surrounding the Battle of Little Bighorn. So it's 1876. Can you talk about what's happening in the U.S. at the time leading up to the battle that happened here?
Well, there's a couple of key features prior to this battle that are going on historically. First of all, in 1873, the U.S. economy crashed. The stock market tanked. The banking system went upside down. There was massive unemployment. People couldn't find work. And consequently, the economy was anemic. People were looking for opportunities to pull it out of the doldrums, if you will. Politicians were anxious. And in the summer of 1874, George Armstrong Custer would lead an expedition of 1,000 soldiers into western South Dakota, the Black Hills. The official motivation for that tour, if you will, was supposedly to check out fort sites, potential military fort sites. But in reality, it was a mission to examine the potential for gold existing in the Black Hills. And of course, evidence of gold was found. Reports quickly got out. All you have to do is get to the Black Hills and walk through the grass, pick up nuggets off the tops of your shoes, and go home rich.
That easy.
Miners and prospectors poured into the Black Hills. Only problem is they were all illegal aliens, because the Treaty of 1868 forbids white people to be in the Black Hills. The Black Hills belong to the Sioux, guaranteed for eternity, if you will, until the waters no longer flow.
Right.
So we've got white intrusion into the Black Hills that's illegal. President Grant's on the horns of a dilemma because he's getting pressured to rev up the economy and create jobs and open up more economic opportunities.
Right. So U.S. government was prepared, I guess, to look the other way at that point.
Eventually, initially, Grant tried to stop the intrusion into the Black Hills with the Army, but it was like putting a finger in a dike.
Yeah.
And then eventually he offered to buy the Black Hills from the Sioux for $6 million. That was turned down by charismatic leaders, Sitting Bull, others. And then ultimately an ultimatum was issued to the Sioux to get out of the Black Hills and go back to the reservation system and stay there, and do so by January 31st, 1876, or you'd be considered hostile.
So where were they, if not in the Black Hills?
They were beyond the Black Hills to the west. They were in the Powder River country. They were in what was called unceded territory, which the treaty allowed them to hunt in that territory, but not to live there.
Okay. And
so
this is the area that we are in now.
This is the present area
Montana.
that we are in now.
Yeah.
Exactly. So technically they were not allowed to live here, but they could hunt here. Well, you had individuals who lived on the reservation in the wintertime, would come out into this area legally to hunt, but there were also individuals that wanted nothing to do with the reservation at all.
They hadn't even signed the treaty, had they?
Hadn't signed the treaty.
Yeah.
Certainly Sitting Bull, one of those, Crazy Horse, one of those. They wanted nothing to do with reservation life.
Right.
So you've got 3 military columns that are ordered into this area to attempt to bring these people back to the reservation,
Yeah.
or to fight one or the other. And of course, President Grant authorizes all of this.
Okay. So for the Lakota, the Cheyenne, the Arapaho tribes, other tribes that had gathered in this area, who were kind of the leaders and the key players, if you will, there? You did mention the Sitting Bull.
We have Sitting Bull, we have Crazy Horse, we have Gall. These are war chiefs. We have Crow King. We have Rain in the Face. We have other individuals that are prominent in this battle.
Mm-hmm.
You have to remember that there are 7,000 to 8,000 inhabitants in this village on June 25th, 1876, the day of this battle.
Very large
1,500 to 2,000 warriors.
Right.
And so it's a large encampment, not necessarily one that can survive very long in one place,
Mm-hmm.
because there's too many people to feed.
Mm-hmm.
But this was a gathering that took place annually. And these people were out here sort of having a big family reunion, if you will.
Mm.
And they were aware that the Army was seeking them.
All right.
But Crazy Horse had just whipped 1,000 soldiers 30 miles from his village and sent them home.
Now, to be clear, these are both Americans, if you will. These are,
We could say Americans fighting Americans.
right,
We could say
in
that.
a sense, another
Some
civil
people
war.
frame this conflict in that.
Yeah. So you mentioned that the military was seeking these individuals, as well as the large groups, the encampment that was here. Why was that? What was the order? I don't know if we covered that. It was to...
Well, the mission was to find these people and force them back onto a reservation.
Okay.
That was the mission. The greatest fear that the Army had was, number one, how do we find them? And number two, they're going to run. They're going to scatter.
Mm-hmm.
They're not going to fight. And so finding them was one thing, containing them was another. Very difficult assignment.
Yeah, because your mission isn't achieved if they scatter and flee.
That's correct, and go to the four winds, which is what they had done and demonstrated over and over again.
Okay.
Now, I should mention this. Conceptually, the idea of this military plan, if you will, was to get this off the ground during the wintertime, when the villages were immobile, no grass for the ponies, very difficult to move in 40 below zero weather.
Right.
And the initial plan was to get these guys out into the field during the wintertime before spring and the grass comes up.
But we're not talking wintertime at this point. When this
Not
encampment-
on June 25th, 1876. Now, George Crook did get into the campaign in March. On March 17th, he attacked the Cheyenne camp along Powder River,
Okay.
destroyed the camp, burned it to the ground, and initiated the campaign of 1876. Out of Fort Ellis, Colonel John Gibbon was in the country in mid-March. And so those two columns got into the field early, but George Custer and the United States 7th Cavalry did not get into the field. They left May 17th, 1876. It took them 6 weeks to get to here on June 25th, 1876. They traveled 400 miles.
Wow. Largely by horse or by foot?
Horse, mules, some wagons.
So June, it's hot.
It's hot.
It's not the original intent of wintertime. These folks are a lot more mobile.
Right. They're in much better shape to maneuver than they are
Absolutely.
in January.
Right. So there's actually another group that I also wanted to mention. There were Crow and
Arikara.
Thank you. Scouts, which Custer was employing, and also a few other Native American tribes. Why were they working with Custer?
Well, the answer to that is sometimes complex, but the Crows and the Arikaras hated the Sioux.
Right.
Because the Sioux were shoving the Crows out of their own territory.
Mm-hmm.
This was Crow land in 1876, this Powder River
territory.
country. This Valley of the Little Bighorn was Crow land by treaty. And the Sioux were more numerous and they were more dominant. And so the Crows and the Sioux fought frequently over territory, ultimately over resources.
Right.
And so the Crow wanted their land back, and they thought if they aligned themselves with the Army, they had a good chance of getting it.
Right.
The Arikaras were beat up by the Sioux constantly. They were just harangued and harassed to no end by the Sioux.
Right.
And so the Arikaras wanted to fight the Sioux for vengeance. And so there's a lot of bad blood between these tribes.
So it wasn't just let's support Custer and getting them back to that reservation, but also there was, as you say, conflict and
there was
blood.
bad blood.
So
there was bad blood. Now, if you look at the results of that battle, the United States government lost the battle, but they won the war. And if you notice today, this is Crow land.
It is, yeah.
They got their land back. It's not Sioux land, it's Crow. Cheyenne's got land, and the Sioux are east of here.
So speaking of the land and the landscape that we have here, just to kind of get a feel for the battle that went on, since we are audio only, I'm wondering if you can help paint a picture, describe this area for the listeners. And what was this area like in June of 1876?
Well, on the day of the battle, it was hot.
Yeah.
Well into the 90s. There was very little wind, with the sun beating down. The battle happened, it began at high noon. Children were swimming in the river. Women were picking vegetables. Men were lounging. It had been quite a gathering, almost a party atmosphere the night before the battle. There was dancing. Young men were meeting girls. They were in a recreation mode, in a sense, if you will. A lot of family activities, I suspect, renewing old friendships. There was not a great concern that they were in harm's way. They were big, they were powerful, and they had just whipped an army the week before, and their medicine was high. They were feeling very confident in that way. They're camped along the Little Bighorn River in the valley bottom. There's plenty of water, plenty of grass for the horses. There's a herd of horses grazing to the west of the village. There's 20,000 horses grazing. 20,000. So it's a idyllic atmosphere in a sense. One, I'm sure, that was very pleasing to those people who were here to enjoy the moment with their families.
So they're camped in the valley by the Little Bighorn River. There are hills surrounding. We're talking to you now from atop a hill that overlooks this valley area.
Yes.
So I think that's important to mention from a lay of the land.
To the east of the river, there are some precipitous bluffs that rise up quite steeply from the river banks. Rolling hills, steep bluffs, a terrain that makes it difficult for open vistas, visual contact, difficult to attain and maintain, so easy to maneuver around and not be seen. Access to the village from a military perspective was one that Custer had to negotiate, and they were not familiar with the territory. The Crow Scouts were. And so when the attack began, maneuvering to get into position for an effective military attack was difficult for Custer's particular portion of the command.
Right. So that's all important to note. So can you begin to walk us through the battle itself? How did this engagement begin?
Well, we have to go back to about 4:30 in the morning.
Okay.
Because Custer has sent Crow and Arikara scouts on ahead up to a high point called the Crow's Nest in the Wolf Mountains, 13 miles from the Valley of the Little Bighorn. And at about 4:30 in the morning, those scouts look down into the valley and they see smoke rising from the teepees. They're convinced it's a massive camp. In the meantime, during the night, Custer has roused his men from a sound sleep. and they force night march up to the base of the Wolf Mountains, banging cups on their saddles as they follow one another in the dusty gloom. They go into camp about 2:30 in the morning. Men and horses are exhausted. At 4:30 in the morning, when the Crow Scouts and the Arikaras see signs of the village, they go back to get Custer. He gets up there about 7 o'clock in the morning to the Crow's Nest. He looks down into the valley of the Little Bighorn with his spyglass, but he can't see anything because all the breakfast campfires have now turned the valley, for a better description, into Los Angeles.
Just a big haze.
A big haze. He can't see anything, but the scouts are convinced there's a village there, and they tell him to look for worms in the grass. Well, what they're referring to is the 20,000 horses grazing on the western bluffs, milling about, feeding worms in the grass. Custer can't see them. His scouts have various opinions as to what to do. Some of them say, don't go down there, don't go down there. There's too many Otas Sioux, too many soldiers Sioux.
Yeah.
Don't go down there. But others say, attack, attack, the village will run away. It'll scatter. And Custer comes off the divide, and his plan is to rest all day Sunday and attack at dawn the next morning on Monday, the June 26th. But he finds out that they've been spotted by Sioux and Cheyenne, and he thinks that the element of surprise is gone. So he goes into high gear, immediately orders an attack at high noon. They come off the divide, they begin to approach the village, and they fracture their command. Custer sends Captain Frederick Benteen off to the south with 125 men, 3 companies. The scout to the south. Benteen hates Custer's guts. Has no use for him. Custer hates Benteen, and Reno hates both of them. Reno and Custer come off the divide, 12 miles out, 7 miles out, 3 miles from the Little Bighorn. A scout named Gerard sees 60 warriors racing to the north towards the camp. He screams out, "There go your Indians, General, running like devils." Custer sends immediate orders to Major Marcus Reno. Major Reno, the village is just ahead and running away. Move forward as rapid a gait as you deem prudent. Sweep everything before you. Pitch into anything, and you'll be supported by the whole outfit.
Custer pledges support at that point.
You'll be supported by the whole outfit.
So Reno is attacking. Why is he so concerned about support?
Well, I think Reno was uncomfortable with the clarity of the orders that he was given.
Okay.
He was told to charge the village, sweep everything before him, and he would be supported by the whole outfit. I don't know that he visualized where that support may come from. And as he roared down the valley with 140 men, and it became apparent to him that the village was not running away, he also knew that it was substantial in size.
Yeah,
because
so how does one
scouts
sweep that many with 140
so how does,
people?
what is he supposed to do with 140 men?
Right.
I think he had anxiety as he approached that village. He did not have combat experience against Indians. He was lacking perhaps professional competence in this sort of endeavor.
Okay.
And I think he was nervous. He suffered, I believe Lieutenant Godfrey said Reno suffered from nervous timidity.
And he was new to this game, it sounds like.
He was relatively new to this game, without a doubt. He had made some major screw-ups during the campaign prior to this.
Yeah, so here he is leading 140 people against a force that he's beginning to realize is insurmountable for...
He's starting to question the capacity for the command to be successful.
Yeah.
Without a doubt. And then he's looking around wondering where his support's going to come from.
Sure.
Perhaps before he even needed support. Perhaps.
So what were Custer's movements in the meantime?
Well, Custer advanced to the north. Reno attacked from the south. Custer moved north.
Okay.
He got up on top of the bluffs, looked down into the valley several times to see what was taking place. By the time he attacked at Medicine Tail Coulee, he knew Reno was engaged, but he was unable to penetrate into the Cheyenne camp. Quicksand stopped him at the river along with Cheyenne gunfire.
Oh, okay.
And he had to fall back to higher ground. Still, and there's strong evidence to support this, still he was seeking a way to maintain the offensive, and he moved farther to the north, which is somewhat of a controversial assessment.
Moving further to the north at that point? Okay.
Correct, because once again, we cannot query any individual soldiers because none survived.
Yeah.
But Custer did advance to the north and try to cross the Little Bighorn River, we believe, to capture the non-combatants, women and children who had run away from Reno's advance.
Okay. So why do we think that? Why do we think that Custer might have been attempting to capture?
Well, whenever we talk about Custer's maneuvers, we have to consider two things. We have to consider what the Indian survivors testified to, because they wind up being the only witnesses.
Yeah.
And also to the archaeological discoveries that substantiate considerably Indian testimony. So we have those two sources, archaeology and Indian testimony, and both those corroborate the concept that Custer moved to the north, descended down to the river, and was repulsed and driven back.
Okay. And then you said his intent was perhaps to cut off those who were fleeing and take captives. He'd
had prior
been known
experience
for taking captives before.
Yes, he had prior experience. He had 3 Indian fights prior to this, and taking hostages was a central strategy, if you will, in his repertoire, because he found out that if you could take hostages, you could manipulate Indian warrior behavior.
It had worked for him before.
It had worked for him before.
Yeah.
And so what he does here is very similar in its attempt to create chaos, force non-combatants to flee, capture them, and the battle's over. He did it at Washita, Oklahoma Territory in 1868. Was successful with that plan. It didn't work here.
No, it didn't. And yet he was trying to maintain that offensive, as you said, although they had lost the element of surprise at this point. When he was
all of us tend to do what's successful for us.
Yeah.
And so why would he be any different?
Especially in a moment of high stress and chaos, which this certainly would have been.
I believe probably in his own head, his battle strategy was fairly pronounced in his own mind, fairly clear.
Yeah.
But he didn't communicate it at all with his subordinates, which to some degree may have committed to his demise.
Yeah. So Custer is attempting perhaps to provide that support. Reno is routed and forced to retreat, correct? And then
that's an interpretation of what happened.
Okay. And it's, again, difficult to puzzle this all together because, as you say, very few witnesses and certainly no survivors on the part.
Well, we have a lot of witnesses. We've got 1,500 to 1,700 witnesses.
Okay, yeah.
We don't have a lot of military witnesses in terms of Custer's command. We don't have any.
Yeah. So insights into what they were thinking, perhaps.
Yes, in the aftermath of this, we do have military testimony as to what they saw in terms of the position of troopers who had been destroyed and what it appeared to look like. Benteen made a comment regarding some of the troop dispositions. He said you could take a handful of corn and throw it on the ground, and that's what it looked like.
Just scattered randomly.
Yes.
Yeah. Sounds like chaos.
It was. It was. One of the archaeologists who spent a great deal of time trying to interpret the aftermath of the archaeological research of 1984-85 from the fire, Richard Fox, called it tactical disintegration.
84 and 85. Oh, that was when the
fire of 84 left the ground barren of vegetation, and thousands of artifacts were found on top of the ground, and artifacts tell a story in their own right. And then when you couple those with a lot of the native testimony, we had a much clearer view of what was going on here than we did before that.
Through some forensics, archaeology, and then accounts from the natives, you say there were lots of stories. Can you speak to some of those accounts and what is going on from that perspective?
Well, that's a complex task.
It is.
Because you've got 1,500 to 1,800 warriors, and they all have their own individual perspective of what's going on.
Yeah.
And this battlefield is quite large.
Stretches
and so
over several miles,
what someone was doing in one particular portion of the battlefield, something else was happening a mile away.
Right.
And so you've got individuals who saw certain things at different times, at different places on the battlefield. So we could spend days and weeks talking about what individuals saw.
Right.
But collectively, you sift all through this and you can come up with some general ideas or some crystal clear perspectives at times as to what happened in this battle. Certainly the archaeology supports many of the Indian accounts, but it appears as though once Custer tried to get across the river at Medicine Tail Coulee,
which is where he encountered the quicksand
and the Cheyenne gunfire,
yeah.
Very slowly, the aftermath of that maneuver, warriors began to pressure his command more intensely by the minute, until eventually, on top of the high ground along Battle Ridge, various military detachments and companies are rolled up and destroyed. As they work to the north and the northwest, more and more and more men are panicked. They've lost their horses. They're low on ammunition because they have ammunition in the horses and the saddle packs, which the Indians, that's their primary goal, is to take away your mobility. And once your mobility is gone, you're on foot and you're virtually in deep, deep trouble at that point in time. So that is spiraling out of control. Custer swings to the north, cannot get across the river. He has to fall back where he digs in on top of Last Stand Hill. And by the time that happens, almost his entire command has been destroyed. And the battle lasts another 15 minutes, 20 minutes, and everybody's dead.
Completely routed and over very quickly. Yeah. So we're talking, you said 1,500 to 2,000 warriors in this encampment.
Bearing down onto Last Stand Hill.
Yeah. So for more of that story and history and perspective, listeners can certainly find plenty of resources. You do a great talk here. A lot of other rangers do excellent interpretations, and it's also very important to be here in the landscape, I think, to be able to point and show how this may have played out.
Yes, I don't believe you can understand this battle clearly at all without coming here.
Right.
And seeing the landscape and moving across the land. It's like painting into thin air without a canvas.
Right.
You have to have a canvas, and the land is the canvas. And when you can see how this unfolded, you begin to understand the potential strategies that Custer applied here, why he perhaps might have chosen those tactics, how the whole thing began and ended and came apart.
Right.
You can see that there's a great deal of territory between these different commands. Communication was very difficult. There's all kinds of those types of elements that play into this story. There's over 3,000 books written about this battle. It's been discussed in movies, or the centerpiece of movie themes 37 times the last time I counted. So there's plenty of Hollywood, for the most part, fabrication going on here.
Sure.
There's books that are extremely accurate, but they're few and far between, comparatively speaking, to the numbers that have been written. It's the most mythologized piece of military history we have. There's more myth floating around this story than any other story that I can think of in history.
And still a good bit of conjecture as well.
There is substantial conjecture. However, we know more now than we've ever known before, without a doubt.
Yeah.
The fire of '84,
which helped with the archaeology.
With the archaeology, the archaeological tools available, technology, all of these things have advanced our understanding of what happened here. And also, we pay a lot closer attention now than we ever have to warrior accounts and those people that survived and saw all of this. Because for a lot of years, little credence was given to them and what they had to say for a number of reasons that are all founded primarily in racial overtones.
Yeah, because it was a cultural conflict. It was a conflict over land. And now by holding this land sacred, it seems like we're beginning to paint more on that canvas. You say this land is the canvas, so.
I would say that, if I understand your question, I would say that the study of this battle has become more inclusive, much more inclusive over the last 25 or 30 years, to take into account those people who were here and saw what happened firsthand, and yet were ignored well into the 60s.
Yeah, we see that even in the naming of the place, right? Because it was originally called Custer Battlefield National Monument. And
Correct. In 1991.
In 1991, it was redesignated.
Yes, the federal government redesignated the name to Little Bighorn Battlefield National Monument. They kept the cemetery as Custer National Cemetery.
So Custer's name is
still attached to the story.
Still attached, certainly. And yet more nods to that perspective and the different sides of the story. We have the Indian Memorial now, right? And then
yes, the Indian Memorial was dedicated in 2003 to the warriors and tribes who fought in a desperate attempt to hang on to their very way of life. That memorial is long overdue. And I've been coming here for years. And this used to be a very angry place. Yeah, the Indian Memorial has done a great deal to dampen the anger and bitterness and resentment that existed here between Indian people and white people for well over 100 years. This place, there's a tranquility here now. There's a peace that did not exist prior to the erection of the Indian Memorial.
Yeah, I felt that, particularly going to visit the Indian Memorial, which sort of takes in this large memorial that was erected shortly after the battle by the US government, which of course is still there. We have a very unique feature of this battlefield, which is all the markers of the soldiers that fell, those white markers that were also put by the government. So can you talk about those markers and then some of the more recent additions?
Well, the soldier markers are a little bit misleading in some ways because they were placed here 14 years after the battle and placed on the battlefield where graves appeared to have been. And so they're certainly not GPS authentic, if you will. And they tend to sometimes mislead people because there are certain places on the battlefield where there should be a lot more markers than there are. And there's other places where there's more markers than there should be. And so the markers are misleading. If you want to use the markers as a template for exactly how things went down, that's a mistake.
Yeah.
Because again, 14 years is a long time.
It is.
Yes. 5 years after the battle, all of the soldiers that could be found, the human remains on the battlefield, were scraped up and a mass grave dug on top of the hill, and 220 soldiers deposited in a mass grave where the monument now stands. That took place in 1881.
That's the big granite that stands atop the last stand hill.
Now, in the early 90s, red markers were placed on the battlefield to indicate where warriors fell in the battle. And we placed, I believe, 17 of those markers. We're not aware of any other sites where Indian warrior markers should be placed. People often ask why. Well, people after the battle, Native families picked up the victims of the battle, the Indian warriors who fell, and took them away and buried them later in trees and caves and scaffolding beyond this place.
Yeah, and I can imagine that being a very personal thing for them to want to share.
Right.
Yeah. So again, perhaps not historically accurate, but still very poignant.
Yes.
To see these moving markers on the landscape.
Yes, very moving.
Yeah. This is the first battlefield that we've visited and done a podcast at. So I think it's important to ask this question: why protect and preserve battlefields? Why is that an important part of the NPS mission?
Well, that's a good question that deserves an answer. I think that I would frame that in the idea that if you're talking about battlefields, you're talking about human drama. You're talking about human catastrophe. You're talking about human loss. And is there anything more powerful in the human experience than death and sacrifice? And so if we're not willing to remember and recognize and commemorate these places where men lost their lives fighting for perhaps something that they deeply believed in, or in some cases fighting because they were called, if we can't commemorate and hold in honor of these places, then I think we lose who we are as a people.
Well said. So what lessons can we learn from Little Bighorn today?
Well, I guess for me, we have to be able to learn somehow to not be so incredibly judgmental in how we look at the way other people live and how they make their way. Because really, when you examine why this all happened, it's a clash of cultures.
It is. Yeah.
And one culture attempting to dominate and extinguish another because they have the inability, or they don't have the ability, to step back and dismiss their own powerful judgments of that culture and allow it to sustain itself. There's other issues involving this clash that I don't know will ever go away. And as long as mankind is willing to kill each other over resources, I don't know if we have any hope. Because what initially started out to be a war or started out to be conflict, perhaps, I think was resource-based.
Yeah.
And then it became malignant because of the inability to have any appreciation for a person with a different culture.
Yeah. Those are lessons we can learn.
We've had opportunities to learn. I don't know that we've grasped them or embraced them.
So I have another question, but I have a long preface to it. You've lived on these grounds seasonally for several years. You've written a book about Little Bighorn. You've added to that repertoire of 3,000. On your author page, which we found on Facebook, you said you didn't want to write just another book on tactics, cultural differences, and how it happened, but rather how it felt to be here on that day. You're obviously very connected to this place. So what does that connection look and feel like to you?
Well, we may be covering some ground we have already walked on, but when you boil it all down, this is a human story. It's about humanity, and it's about human suffering, which we are engulfed in if we look around. And when I do what I do here at Little Bighorn, when I talk about the battle, when I present the story to visitors from all over the world, I want people to feel what happened here. I want them to emotionally connect with the enormity of loss and suffering that was the result of this conflict. I don't care directly if they understand what firearms were used, what tactics were in operation, what the hierarchy of command was, even though those things play a role in understanding the story. But I want them to feel what happened here. And so I try to paint words, or paint images, I try to paint images, pictures, if you will, with words that bring about powerful emotions. Did that answer the question?
It did. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I think so.
Okay. Because lots of people have talked about guns and equipment and tactics and chain of command, all of those things, thousands and thousands of books.
Yeah.
But my book is all about trying to introduce the visitor, or the reader, if you will, to the emotions that clawed at these people during this epic event.
Yeah.
What was it like? That's why the title, Little Bighorn, Voices from a Distant Wind. There's a different perspective.
Very evocative, yeah. So let's go just a little bigger picture, because you've been with the Park Service, albeit seasonally, but certainly with the Park Service for an extended period now, 8 years. So what is the importance of the National Park System to you, and why is it important to preserve places like this?
I think once again, when you look at it globally, you step back and you say, this is the essence of our heritage. This is where we've come from.
Right.
This needs to be a reflection of who we are, what we believe, what we cherish, what we value. And so to maintain these places, to preserve these places, provides an opportunity to not only understand where we've been, but where we're going as a citizen, as a group of people who live in a democratic society.
Yeah.
These things are important to us. They're a reflection of what matters.
And I think we see that evolution in this place, even in the very thing we talked about, with just the naming and the evolution of the angry place that you mentioned, and now a place of peace.
You can feel this place. It will talk to you.
Mm-hmm.
And you don't have to strain to hear it.
When we preserve national battlefields, it gives us an opportunity to learn from history and keep ourselves from repeating it. The story of westward expansion and war with Native Americans is fraught with misunderstandings and cultural clashes. Do we still have these problems? How can we remedy them? As humans, we tend to tell history from our own perspective, but it's our duty to understand both sides so we can learn from events and incorporate those lessons into our everyday lives. The National Park Service has evolved to incorporate accounts from many different angles to give us a much more complete picture. And Little Bighorn Battlefield is no exception. Originally, they erected the monument to pay tribute to Custer. Now, the site tells a much deeper story of human tragedy and reminds us of the peace that can be reached through acceptance and understanding. If you enjoyed what you heard, review us on iTunes or your favorite podcast provider to help more people find our show. For more behind the scenes and bonus episodes, join our Patreon community. New patrons receive a personalized postcard from one of the national parks featured on the show. A link is posted in our show notes or visit podcastswithparkrangers.com. Stay with us through the final minutes for a short preview of our next episode. We like to highlight on our show ways that a typical park visitor can give back to their national parks. All of our public lands are in search of volunteers, whether it's with the Bureau of Land Management, the U.S. Forest Service, or the National Park Service, which includes Little Bighorn Battlefield National Monument. There's probably a volunteer opportunity in your area. To find out more information, visit volunteer.gov. Even though we interview park rangers, we are not affiliated with the National Park Service, and any views expressed are not necessarily those of the Park Service. We're just fans of the national parks, like you. Coming up in episode 18 of Podcasts with Park Rangers, we visit Glacier National Park in northern Montana to explore the life of a much different kind of park ranger, the Bark Ranger. We'll find out how man's best friend became a wildlife safety advocate and a well-loved park celebrity.